You are listening to the Bail Post. Welcome to the next episode of our podcast. And on today's episode, we have the current district attorney of Harris County, Kim Ogg. Kim Ogg, thank you so much for coming and agreeing to talk to me today.
Thank you, Ken. Good. I'm looking forward to it.
Well, if you've listened to our podcast, you know that I don't like to just say, hey, tell me about yourself. I like to do research to find out what I can find out. And from looking at your background, you were born in Houston and you attended the University of Texas at Austin, and you got a BA degree in journalism. Talk about growing up in Houston.
You know, Houston in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, 2010s, I've lived here all my life, except the years I lived in Austin in college. And I've seen the growth and changes in our city, and I understand our people because I am one. We are really a unique breed here in Houston. We are fiercely independent, and I think that's true in all subject matter areas, including criminal justice. We are a fairly blue county in a very red state, and yet our people believe in law and order and are very supportive of police officers in almost every instance. I think
I've always described Texas as, a right of center state, because even when your father was, a legislator in Texas, he was kind of considered right of center. So, even when Texas was under Democrats, we were still right of center. So Texas has always been a law and order conservative state.
it still is. I think even in the face of the new criminal justice reform as it's been enacted by different people, I think most of our public is more to center and supports police, supports prosecution, and supports the concept of bail as not just a good idea, but it's in our Constitution. And so growing up here, I exhibit many of the same traits as the other Houstonians. I'm independent. And I think that is probably the hallmark of my administration, especially when it comes to our position on bail and bail reform.
Well, you're a little bit different than the normal person because your dad was in politics. He was in the House for years, and then he was in the Senate. In fact, I heard that he had the Senate seat that Senator Whitmire held. So he was like the person who followed your dad in that seat. Is that correct?
It is. I still live in Senate District 15, and Jack, my father, was the state senator there from 1972 to 1983 when John Whitmire took over for the next 40 years until he became mayor.
What was it like growing up with Jack Ogg, the politician, and your mom, Connie Ogg?
They were very civically minded. They were always looking out for the greater good. So, example, we'd take a vacation and go to Florida, and they would see these beautiful beaches with no cars and safe pedestrians. And they'd come back and say, well, let's change the access to beaches in Texas. That was very unpopular. My dad was an active non-smoker and believed in the rights of non-smokers and passed some of the first legislation against smoking in government buildings. Again, wildly unpopular, and yet it succeeded. And now no smoking, not just areas, but laws are very common. So I grew up with people who were really interested in changing the greater good and were part of the political system. And that, of course, gets into your DNA.
I saw a picture of you on your night that you were elected DA of Harris County, and I saw a picture of your dad with you. So that had to be a special moment for your dad to see his daughter become the Harris County District Attorney.
Thank you, Ken. It really was. He swore me in on January 2nd of 2017, and that was really, really special. So thank you for noting that. My folks were the type of political people that got poorer, not richer, from their service. They listened to people who would come by our home or call on the phone and need help or want changes, and then they would work on doing them. And my parents were a team. Our whole family was a team. So politics is just something that we understand is a action role, not a passive role in America and in Houston.
Well, I saw that you went to the South Texas College of Law. That's where you met your partner. Talk about, law school is a different experience for different people. I mean, I was the quintessential nerd, loved everything about it. I was in law school almost every day. I did 3 competitions a semester. I was on law review. I was like nerd, 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 nerd. What was your experience in law school? Because some people just say, oh, I just have to get through it.
You know, my experience was, because I grew up with a lawyer dad who was also a politician, is that I was never going to be a lawyer and certainly would not run for office. So I worked in journalism for about 4 years and found I could not only not make any money, I was a slow writer, and I ended up making a living at odd jobs, which was not ideal. So when I went to law school, it was with the idea that I would simply be qualified for a higher paying job. I had no great philosophical ambitions. On the very first day at South Texas, I fell in love with the law.
Mhm.
And it's because it is the way that we right injustices in the world. And that struck a chord with me. And my life really has not been the same. And I credit a lot of that to South Texas College of Law for providing me an education by people who actually worked in the law. They were not ivory tower professors, they were federal judges, they were local litigators. And we turn out trial ready lawyers. And that's how I wound up at the district attorney's office.
Well, I was a kid right off the farm. I mean, we were a farming community, 24 people in my class of high school, 4 people went to college. And, when I went to law school, I was a fish out of water, but I kind of had that eye-opening experience where I mean, the luck would have it, I had the hardest teacher for writing, legal writing in your first year. And the very first paper he handed out, I was like, oh my God, I may be able to do this because I got a good grade. And there was a lot of people that didn't, and because he was a hard teacher. And I was like, I might be able to get through this.
I love it.
Well,
Well, you certainly did.
now I see that your son is in law school at the University of Texas in Austin. I mean, 3rd generation now. I mean,
His
I
name
mean,
is Jack Justice Jordan.
oh, Jack, also like in honor of your father. Wow.
Yes, and then also in honor of my partner Olivia's father,
Mhm.
Eustace Jordan, but it's spelled Justus, and so Americans
Mm,
pronounced it
wow.
Justice, and we felt it was perfect for our son and a tribute to our fathers to name him after both of them.
Well, I mean, you've done something right. I mean, you didn't want to go to law school, but you did, and you've been very successful. And your son, I went to the same college my parents went to, so I was 2nd generation, and my parents met there. And I told my daughter when she got old enough to go, she would not be the 3rd generation to go to that college. But I think that's a tribute to y'all. I mean, it says something about your family, about challenging people to want to do something hard, but also to do service.
I think service in America, whether it's military, whether it's public service, I think it's really important for us to understand that our freedom is not free and that it depends on the average American to seek the greater good through their professional skills, through their life work. I just think we all need to contribute to our country. I wanted to serve. Interestingly, because I was part of the LGBTQ community,
Mhm,
as I grew up, there were no out gay politicians. They couldn't get elected in either
mhm.
party, certainly not in Texas. And so one thing that we've seen is, as the world changed and America embraced marriage equality, it gave people like me the chance to
Mhm,
advance in public service. And that was important. We saw changes in the military, changes in the way benefits were distributed, and a lot of wrongs or inequalities, inequities in our country were corrected. And that was done through the law. And so this idea of using our legal system to address social inequities is also very important. And being DA is all about justice and whether we can treat people equally under the law while still considering their individual circumstance. And that's just what we're supposed to do.
Well, before we move on, I would, just ask you if you have one of your favorite stories about Jack. And I'll even say, let me tell you a story about my oldest daughter, Darby, because, she's 6 years older than my youngest, and my youngest is a special needs daughter, and she has some arm issues. And so when she was born at 2 weeks, my wife took her to Darby school. And so the kids were talking about Laurel's arms look funny. So Darby came home and said, Laurel's arms look funny. And so she and I talked about it. And we talked about how we've been praying for a second child for a long time, and that sometimes God's looking out for families that will help him raise his children that need a little extra attention. So for the next month, everybody that Darby ran into, she's like, we're helping God raise Laurel. And that's one of my favorite stories of Darby. And so do you have any favorite stories of Jack growing up?
Well, yes, it has to do with accountability and parenting. Because we were two women raising a young boy, I knew there would come a time when we would get to the point of where he would say, "Make me,"
Hmm.
and
Oh,
and we were physically not, of course, able to make him. So it happened when he was 10. We were out doing some yard work, and he had the hose, and you can guess what happened next. He sprayed me. He looked at me, I looked at him, he sprayed me right in the face. He dropped the hose immediately and took off running. We ran around the house twice with me chasing him till I got a stitch in my side. And that's when I realized, hey, Og, use your legal skills. We got to
yes.
come up with a different plan. And so that's when phone privileges and
Mm.
money came to be the leverage that women raised a young boy with. But it's all turned out great. He's very respectful of both of us as his mother. And he just made 2 A's and a B+ in law
Wow.
school. He's waiting on the 4th grade. I couldn't be prouder of him.
Well, when you graduated from law school, you went to work at the DA's office in Harris County with former DA Johnny Holmes. Talk about that experience.
1987, Texas was experiencing a major crime wave. The
Hmm.
penitentiary system was full. There were not enough penitentiary beds, and
Hmm.
individuals were being paroled out of the Harris County Jail, sometimes getting as much as 30 days credit for one day
Hmm.
in actual custody. The result of the revolving door at the penitentiary was an enormous spike in the crime rate, which wasn't good to begin with. So I came in the middle of a crisis that looks a lot like the crisis that we've been in for
Hmm.
the last 4 years.
Yes.
And we had to figure out what to do. So it was all a matter of priorities. Mr. Holmes pursued the death penalty in every eligible case.
Mm.
And that meant we all worked on very serious cases, rapes, robberies, murders. Obviously not as young DAs. We had the usual training, domestic violence, DWI, misdemeanor cases, but it moved pretty quickly. And I tried over 100, well, I tried about 85 cases while I was a young DA. Now we see a far less active judiciary that tries far fewer cases. Our lawyers don't get that much experience in a condensed amount of time, but they get more experience than the civil lawyers who can pay a lot more, but can't give them that trial experience that, as you know, is so critical to
Sure.
being a successful litigator.
When I was graduating from law school, that was the number one selling point for going to DA's office. You got lots and lots of trial experience. So you worked your way up in the DA's office. You were appointed as the first director for the Houston's anti-gang task force in 1994. You ran for district judge in 1996. And then you worked for a time with Crime Stoppers, and I'm assuming the same Crime Stoppers of Houston that you seem to work so well with even today. And then in 2016, you were elected to the district to be district attorney of Harris County.
As a young DA, there was a dispute going on in the city about whether we had a gang problem or
Hmm.
not. I happened to be the gang prosecutor assigned by Johnny Holmes to prosecute gang murders in the Special Crimes Division. I was at a function where we were asked to speak on the gang problem. I'll never forget it. I was sitting next to Chief Sam Nucci. He was in full
Hmm.
uniform, very tall, big, robust guy, big booming voice. They asked if we had a gang problem. He said Houston had no gang problem. I was super intimidated, but I knew that that was not the right answer. And so they asked me the question. I said, we have a war going on in our streets.
Mhm.
The next day, I got a call from Mayor Bob Lanier inviting me to come over. He asked me what I would do about the gang problem off the cuff. I told him, and then
Mhm.
he hired me. And it was policies and programs designed to keep Harris County from turning into Los Angeles, Chicago,
Mhm.
or the cities where you had real entrenched violent gangs. And we did, we still do, but we never became gang central like those cities did. And I credit a lot of that to the mayor and my work with the police force and the Texas legislature. Crime Stoppers, you mentioned, is important because it's a partnership, a private public
Mhm.
partnership between government and Crime Stoppers, a nonprofit entity, and we caught more fugitives and solved more unsolved cases than any Crime Stoppers in the world during the years that I was there. So I love catching crooks. I like helping victims. Policies and programs were not as much fun to work on as individual cases, but it all gave me the background to be district attorney.
I noticed that in 2016 you were elected, and you were elected with the support of George Soros or his groups. And then when you ran for reelection, you did not have his support, and you still won. You had a big coalition for your reelection in the general election. And then in our primary 2 months ago, not only were you not supported by Soros, but your opponent had a lot of support by Soros. I did an interview with someone a couple of weeks ago, and they were saying, there's some common elements with people who are supported by Soros. And he was making the point that they don't do drug enhancements anymore. They stopped doing that. So my question to you is, if you receive the support of a Soros or one of his groups, i- do they? Is there some way that they say, here's what we would prefer that you do in the way you perform criminal justice after you take
So
office?
it's a great question. The Soros Coalition of progressive prosecutors began with Kim Fox in Chicago in 2015. I was running in 2016 for the second time. My opponent in the primary, Judge Morris Overstreet, was supported by Soros. They spent a
Mhm.
lot of money on him, but I had greater name identification and I
Mhm.
won here. Soros was not the the substantial financial support down here for me at that time. So he ran against me. My opponent failed. And then in the general, um, I was supported by Soros. There was no meeting.
Mhm.
The money was directed indirectly to me. And so there was no discussion about what my program or policies would be. All they knew was what I had said publicly. I didn't know anything about them. It was
Sure.
about $600,000. My opponent at the time, DA Devin Anderson, jailed a rape victim. And it came to light in July of 2016. That was devastating
Sure.
to Anderson's race. I capitalized on that fatal mistake, and I attribute my win in 2016 to my opponent's mistake more than I do $600,000 from George
Sure.
Soros. So I was never part of his team. I did embrace quite a few ideas about reform, and one of them was bail reform. What I will tell you is I never knew that bail reform, as I contemplated it, would be carried out by George Soros DAs
Sure.
across the country the way that it has been. And in fact, that's been the big rub between myself and the local folks who control the Democratic Party and
Mhm.
have direct access now to Soros. They helped my opponent, Sean Tier, in the Democratic primary to the tune of about $3.5 million. And so it was a very negative campaign, not so much promoting the nominee, Sean Tier, but all aimed at
Once you take office, though, is there any Soros type group that puts on any seminars that they invite you to that they want you to attend, and they talk about different topics about reform?
there is a group that now I know is related to George Soros. At the time, they disclaimed any affiliation with him. That was a lie. The name of that group is FJP, Fair and Just Prosecution.
Mhm.
It's run by a woman named Miriam Krinsky, and she presented FJP as an incubator for bringing forth best practices and policies for newly elected DAs. And they were looking at progressive Democrats. I was a Democrat. I had reform
Sure.
ideas. I accepted the invitations to go, and I heard some good ideas presented at some of those seminars. The break for me from that group came when in 2019, I asked to increase our staff by 104 prosecutors because the formula was, to me, a math formula, a local problem. We had X number of cases and only Y number of
Sure.
prosecutors. The math to get us to a decent caseload required about another 100 prosecutors. Not only did certain members of this commissioner's court as that are currently on it, Rodney Ellis, Adrian Garcia, not only did they work against me, they all voted to deny us the prosecutors based on this fact. The George Soros folks and the FJP folks claimed it was done so that I could incarcerate more Black and brown people. And so they came at what I considered a local budget issue with racially charged accusations against me. And that's when I broke from all of their seminars, quit speaking with them, and they have run hard against me ever since, with the idea that they wanted a more progressive prosecutor,
Sure.
somebody who would agree with them.
Is it these seminars that we get this common makeup where from the district attorneys to not seek drug enhancements, to not prosecute juveniles as adults any longer, not seek long prison sentences? Is that where they're making those recommendations to them?
You know, that was not my experience, but I believe that that group, FJP and George Soros's Open Society group, I believe they have radicalized their agenda and their teachings, and that these uniform policies that are being promoted that you've mentioned are now part of a quid pro quo deal in exchange for support. I know that the nominee who beat me in the primary has championed, for example, no bail. He considers bondsmen the reason that the criminal justice system mass incarcerates minorities. He has said that there will be no conditions of bond, no conditions of probation. And because so few people turn out in the primary and are so poorly informed about the actual topics, that was the philosophy that prevailed in my primary. That's not what Houstonians want. We just saw a Kinder Foundation survey come out that says crime is the #1 concern
Sure.
of Houstonians.
There's an article
it's
that came out today in Politico that said, here's the title: Why Progressive DAs Are Losing Their Grip on the West Coast. And it came out today talking about Portland district attorney lost in the primary on to a tough on crime challenger. The Alameda DA is facing recall currently. The San Francisco DA Bowden was recalled. Gascon, the DA for LA County, only got 20-something% of the vote in the primary, but made it through to the next level because he was one of the top 2 vote getters, but looks very difficult for them to win. And then, so he faces a tough election. It seems like we're starting to see a lot of pushback from the public because these policies are not working. Do you know of any DAs who've suffered legal consequences for following this kind of path of reform?
I do. The social experiment of George Soros and FJP is failing. The policies that they promote to end mass incarceration, which is not a bad goal. None of us want mass incarceration, but what do you do instead? And how do you do it? The devil is in the details. And
But if the
so,
voters were to vote on, if we're going to release this many more criminals and we're going to have more crime as a result, they would vote against that.
of
So
course,
it seems like the public's being told we're going to release more criminals and we're going to have less crime, and we're suffering the consequences because that's not true.
right. It's the media, unfortunately, has been a major player in promoting propaganda. And the propaganda that's being
Mhm.
promoted is crime is really not up, it's down.
Mhm.
That's a lie. Crime hit a 30-year high in terms of the murder rate in Houston from 1992 to 2022. We had
Mhm.
over 550 people murdered here. That is a 30-year high. When it drops down to 480 the next year, yes, it declined from last year, but we're still at a 25-year high.
Yeah.
And yet all you hear in the media is that our perception of crime is wrong, that we believe it's increasing and actually it's decreasing. Well, I would suggest to the media that they're wrong.
Well,
Anytime that HPD doesn't file
mhm.
264,000 cases, yeah, that's going to make the crime rate look better, but
Well, I
it's
did a
not.
podcast with a former DA, assistant DA in New York, and he was dealing with these reforms when they were being enacted in New York, and he said, "Look, the legislators were telling the governor and the mayor in closed doors that they would put up with more crime to get their political agenda, which was to address systemic racism, to reduce the jail population." I did a podcast. I just released it this morning with a former LA County chief deputy from the county jail, and he said uh, the local officials knew what they were doing was going to increase crime, especially when they decriminalized theft under $950. They didn't care. It was a political agenda, and so
The blood is on their hands
yeah.
because anybody who trades other people's public safety for their own political advancement is not thinking of the greater good. You asked me about DAs who've suffered the consequences. Andrew Warren, a former federal prosecutor who was the elected DA in Tampa, Florida, was removed by Governor DeSantis for signing a letter promoted by FJP and Soros that says, "I will never prosecute abortion." Now, he was removed and replaced with a pro-life DA. I suggested to the public, and when I refused to sign the letter, that my duty requires us to consider every case based on the
Mhm.
evidence and the law individually. That's the oath we take. My opponent, with $3.5 million of Soros money, sent 8 separate mailers to our voters saying Kim Ogg is going to enforce the abortion ban promoted by bad old Governor Abbott. And so that was very effective politically and was a big part of why I lost. So you've got Andrew on the East Coast removed for saying he would never prosecute abortion. And yet I lost a political primary because I said I would follow the law and
Mhm.
look at the evidence in each case. And we're boxed in a way between public opinion and what politically sells. And that's a major problem.
Well, let's talk for just a little bit about how we got to where we are now. Texas is a conservative state, and I would say 2 sessions ago, we did bail reform, which was to strengthen criminal justice law, to strengthen Chapter 17 of the Code of Criminal Procedure, not to weaken it. But Harris County's kind of gone down a different path, and it's the litigation path. And, we had the O'Donnell versus Harris County, and you've already mentioned you initially supported it, but you ended up opposing it because you thought it went too far. But so I don't want to spend too much time on the case, but I want to talk about what the ramifications of the case were, because we enacted this local rule 9 that is now governing how we set bail in Harris County for essentially all misdemeanors. And the problem is it says it's following O'Donnell. O'Donnell has now been reversed by the Fifth Circuit, I don't know how many times. And in the Dave's case, the en banc Fifth Circuit said it should have never been filed in at all in the first place. I don't even think the court has jurisdiction to do anything on it anymore. I mean, from the standpoint of even enforce the consent decree. And the law has changed. SB 6 has come in, but we still have local rule 9. And if you look at rule number 2 of the local rules, it says these local rules are not to be interpreted to be in conflict with state law. And yet
They are.
we're not
So,
following state law. We're not doing a public safety report on any misdemeanors before we just release them on a personal bond. Talk about, we're not following state law, and it's having an impact on crime.
right. And I'd like to, and have been trying to do all in my power to stop that. Local Rule 9 was written by Judge Franklin Bynum.
Mhm.
We complained to the board of the Judicial Conduct Board about many awful things done from the bench by Judge Bynum. We reversed him 24 out of 24 times. We mandamused him 2 out of 2 attempts. But Local Rule 9 basically gives our local misdemeanor judges the power to release anyone on a personal recognizance bond.
I think
They've
it's stronger than that. I think it requires them to. They must
Yes,
be
sir.
released. So it actually ties the hand of a reasonable judge. And as you know, as you point out, it was written by Judge Bynum, who describes himself as a Democrat socialist, someone who wants to destroy the criminal justice system. And I would argue he's done a pretty good job in Rule 9 in trying to do that, even though he's now no longer on the bench. And as you mentioned, you filed some judicial ethics issues with him, and
And
they
they haven't
recommend
been resolved.
well, but they recommended he be removed from office, and he's just no longer in office to be removed.
Right. He asked for a trial and we should try him because what he did was contrary to what judges take an oath to do. He refused to follow the law. He's a self-proclaimed anarchist who said he would destroy the system from within. And through Rule 9, many other county court misdemeanor judges here in Houston supported that rule. And so you had almost uniform application of the rule, and nearly everyone charged with a misdemeanor gets out on a get out of jail card free. That's a problem when it comes to stalking cases, DWI, and especially domestic violence. And so we've seen some horrible results when batterers are released on a PR bond and go kill the spouse or the girlfriend who turned them in. And all of that was predictable. That's why I would not support the O'Donnell
Mhm,
settlement. I believe that those exceptions should be preserved and not included in Rule 9. They gave it some lip service, like, oh, we'll
mhm,
exclude these,
mhm,
we'll quote, carve it out. But then they gave themselves a general pass
mhm.
to do whatever they wanted in
Well,
terms
here's the
of.
problem that I see. Rule 9 sets up a charge-based release system. So if you're charged with this misdemeanor, you automatically get released, no matter how many times you're arrested for that charge. I mean, we have examples of where somebody has released 16. I mean, I would have never thought somebody would be released 17 times, but we're setting up on Rule 9 that the court has no option. They can't hold them because we have elevated we've made it a charge-based system. We don't look at their criminal history. We don't look at their failure history background. We just look at it and say, okay, this is the charge. They get an automatic get out of jail free card, and we release them no matter how many times they do it.
And that system creates such a public safety
Mhm,
problem that it became a crisis. What you haven't mentioned is that the felony judges, quote, informally
mhm,
began bail uh, reform when Rule 9 was passed. And so you see an enormous spike in felony defendants released on PR bonds who then went on to commit terrible crimes. And we saw a high in 2021 of 20,000 plus people committing crimes while on bond for another crime. And a significant portion of those individuals were on multiple bonds.
mhm. Before then, you'd never seen somebody arrested for murder, capital murder, released on a personal bond, and suddenly it started happening. I
Yes.
started describing Harris County that just like a dog got one free bite before they were considered dangerous, you get one free murder in Harris County before you're going to be held in jail.
Yes. Well, as you know, Andy Kahn over at Crime Stoppers
Mhm,
compiled a list of victims of individuals who killed them while on bond. This infuriates families because they know, or they come to realize, that the individual who took their husband, father, brother away should never have been on the street. And I think it's not just an insult to the criminal justice system, it's undermining the criminal justice
mhm.
system because, boy, if you think this podcast gets out to a lot of people, you ought to try the Criminal Defendant
Oh, yeah.
Network. They all know what's going
Yeah.
on. And Harris County has become the place where you can commit a lot of crimes and
Mm.
not worry about going back to jail.
Well, see, let me see if you can give me some insight on something. So, a second lawsuit. So O'Donnell was filed for misdemeanors, and then a year later, Russell was filed for felonies to extend the misdemeanor rule to felonies. And you've talked about how judges started informally applying it because the judges were not originally parties to the case. All of the judges wouldn't agree,
Yeah.
but then the attorney general and the governor stepped in and really stopped it, even though the commissioner's court was prepared to just give in. Was
No,
that
the
the point?
commissioner's court was not just prepared to give in. The commissioner's court drove these
Mhm,
lawsuits.
mhm,
So you initially had a Republican-controlled court opposing the bail reform O'Donnell lawsuit and would have opposed the Russell lawsuit, but there was a political change in Harris County that came about in 2018 in that election.
mhm,
Lena Hidalgo and a number of other judges, some of whom had never practiced law, but were lawyers, came into it came into power, and we saw a tremendous change. And so the commissioner's court, who under Republican regime had fought the bail reform lawsuit, under Democratic control became a friendly defendant. And so
mhm.
the O'Donnell settlement is really just cover for what the super progressive mindset of our commissioner's court under Democratic control was promoting. And O'Donnell really was just cover for the judges so that they could say it was a federal,
Sure.
decree. And it gave them the ability, gave commissioners at court the ability to spend up to $94 million on some of these reforms. The DA's office and police saw not $1 of that. But there's a great gift card program down at the public defender's office who work on 15% of the cases for more money than the prosecutors who handle 100% of the cases. It's ridiculous. And it was basically just a cover. That's what O'Donnell was and is. And it needs to be challenged further because I think it can be turned around.
Has there been any discussion since SB 6 passed and since, there was a case from the Court of Criminal Appeals, I think, on December 6th of last year saying that if a criminal court in setting bail does not review the public safety report, that is error and the order setting bail had to be set aside. And even went further and said if the Court of Appeals didn't review the public safety report in the appeal, that was error. Has there been any discussion with the judges that, hey, we shouldn't be following 9.1 or 9 anymore since SB 6 came out and we're required to review criminal histories before setting bail?
Informally, yes, there have been, but the political overlay
Mhm,
is so strong that I believe our judiciary fears primary opponents put forth by powerful members of the commissioner's court, just like was done to me. And so, unfortunately, much of our judiciary falls in line. They do not object. And it's true, they are not following the law. So, I think we have the opportunity through additional litigation to require them to follow the law, perhaps through some judicial complaints, that kind of thing.
mhm,
I don't like painting everyone as bad or good with a broad brush. We have, members of our judiciary who do follow the law. But I will say that Harris County is the tail that wags the dog in Austin, that there's been
mhm.
legislation you've mentioned designed to curb their power. Senate Bill 6 required judges to actually deal with bonds in their courts on violent crimes, and they had to sign their name. They couldn't just allow a magistrate who's out of touch with voters, who's not accessible to be removed by voters. It eliminated that cover. And so by now having to make the decision themselves and sign their name to what is essentially their responsibility, we have seen fewer PR bonds. We've seen fewer insufficient bonds on violent crime, but it has not helped the misdemeanor situation at all. And so you still have a lot of drunk drivers and wife beaters out there being released over and over.
One of the things that I've seen with the Rule 9 is that it elevates ability to pay bail above everything else under 1715. And the sad thing was that was specifically addressed by the Fifth Circuit. that it was not the element, it was one of the factors that the court was to consider. So the court ruled that it wasn't the only factor and it was not to be made the only factor, but in the settlement, they made it the only factor. And now you hear judges say, well, that's just what the law requires. No, it's what your settlement requires in actually going against what the Fifth Circuit ruled.
The the rule is contrary to Texas law,
Mhm,
period. It needs to be attacked and litigated. But I think as long as you have political
mhm.
elections for judges, DA, sheriff, and a funding body like the Commissioner's Court led by super liberals like Rodney Ellis and Lena Hidalgo, you are not going to see judges step out and deviate from Rule 9.
Well,
If
isn't one of the lessons from your recent primary is if you don't follow the dictates of either the local power brokers or Soros,
they'll
that
bring
you're
in
going
millions of dollars to
dollars
defeat you.
to find somebody that will,
Yes,
no
and
matter
so
whether it's good or bad, even if it's just bad for criminal justice, they don't care. They're
that's
going to
true.
do it.
They're looking for their own people who believe in what they believe in and who will do it to the detriment of the public's safety. And that's just that's where I broke with all of those people. My job is public safety.
Mhm.
And
Well, I
so
want to highlight a couple things on crime because we've already talked about, you know, you agree that crime has increased and in part as a result of these changes. But, you know, there's a monitor who's issuing reports every 6 months about how great the misdemeanor reforms are. You issued your own report on to say, I would just highlight two of the things that you said in the report. Number one, that failures to appear had increased by at least 50%. And number two, recidivism had increased greatly. Recidivism is people arrested for crimes, arrested for more crimes in the future. And you were kind of attacked for that. And the monitor came out with a report saying recidivism isn't really up. And, you know, we've seen the same thing happen like in New York and in other jurisdictions, and it becomes a math game. They're playing, I would say, with respect, that I think they're using a statistical analysis that we've even addressed on our a couple of two podcasts ago that intentionally lowers the recidivism rate. And you know, the DA's office in New York and your report uses the statistics that law enforcement uses to calculate recidivism. And now we're stuck in this, oh, crime's not really up, believe us, don't believe them. Crime's really down. So even though you think it's going up, don't believe that.
So the bail monitors are part of the formula to sustain this failed social experiment. The bail monitors make $100,000 every year to publish 2 reports that say bail reform is great. We brought so many problems to their attention, and they would throw up their hands and say, well, we can't tell the judges what to do. Of course, their job was to tell the judges what was wrong with the system. The biggest failure of the bail monitors, both of whom are nice people, is that one, they used flawed statistics.
Mhm.
They used a formula for calculating who came to court that they actually admit doesn't it doesn't reflect how many people come to court. Again, they say the judges have no uniform way of calculating who comes or doesn't, but we're positive more people are coming than ever. So that's not science, that's just propaganda.
Well, let's compare that. So you know, I've looked at the Monitor's report on that specifically extensively because they start out saying, oh, it's like 20%. And then they, you know, kind of keep that for a couple of reports. Then you come out with a report saying it's over 50%. The police officers union comes out with a report saying we reviewed 1 week's docket. It's 75% or more. And then Harris County Court Watch downloaded 2 years worth of data using the same statistics and said 2 years, the average failure to appear rate is 80% in misdemeanor court. So what does the monitor do? On the very next report, it says, well, we really can't say what the failure to appear rate is because we don't really have any usable data for that. So they just threw up their arms and said, it's okay. We
That
just
was
can't tell you what it is.
purposeful. That was
Yeah.
purposeful. When faced with irrefutable statistics, they bailed, so to
Mhm.
speak, and just
I
said,
didn't post that bond.
yeah, me neither. I mean, I don't know. And so It's very disingenuous. You know, if you Google bail reform, you will find 20 entries right at the top of
Mhm,
Google done by various left-wing think tanks, foundations, all who say across the nation, bail reform is working and it's
mhm,
wonderful.
mhm.
And it's just not. That's pure propaganda. It's paid
Absolutely. It's
for.
being rolled back. It's been rolled back in New York 4 times. It's being rolled back in Alaska. It's been rolled back everywhere, almost everywhere. It's just not working. What
Right.
okay, but let's talk about the jail population. You know, we made these changes in the name of addressing systemic racism. So we thought the racial makeup of the jail was out of kilter, and so it had to be addressed. All these years later, is the racial makeup of the jail any different?
I don't, I can't speak scientifically to that because it's not available data through the jail. Here's what I would say. Racism is terrible. Racial disparity occurs. Look at our victim population. Most of our crime victims are Black and brown.
That's what I say. The victims are normally attacked by their same racial group. So we have, if the by and large we have more victims that are of one race, the perpetrator is usually of that same race. That's why we have 50% of all murder victims in the United States young Black males. And it's being done by usually young Black males. And somewhere in this debate, we have elevated the murderer over the victim.
So this racial component, much like the defendant's ability to pay, is
Mhm,
sort of the sole motivator behind the progressive agenda. But it's a flawed theory.
mhm.
Most Americans, when faced with a murdered child, could care less what race
That's right.
the murderer is. Anyone reading the story could care less what race the murderer is. And we are blind in our intake system as to what race a person is. We don't know the victim's race. We don't know the
Mhm,
defendant's race. If they have a record and it comes up, yes, there may be a picture, but it's never factored into our filing analysis because it's not evidence
mhm.
and it's not law.
But here's the problem with that. If they are wrong, if they're incorrect that we have systemic racism running the criminal justice system, who's the group getting most hurt by this?
Well, of
The
course.
very community that they say they're trying to help.
Well, that's why the most powerful spokesmen before the Texas legislature during the last two sessions have been parents of
Mhm,
murdered children, sometimes who were adults themselves, who are either Black or Latino. And why have those people chosen to come forward? Because it was their kids, not because they're of a particular race, but because their family was personally impacted. So I feel terrible that criminal justice has been politicized in a way
mhm,
and propagandized in a way that it actually gets minority communities to vote against their own interest by
mhm.
supporting something like no cash bail for anyone because it's their community that will be hurt the most. And we hear that time and again from them.
Let's talk about the private surety bail systems briefly. But it seems like to me, if you go to one of these seminars that's put on by this group that has support of Soros, one of the things they're going to ask you is you should support bail reform. And they don't care whether it's going to hurt the criminal justice system or help. That's one of the things they want. They recommend you do.
It didn't happen that way with me, but I will tell you that became the litmus
Mhm,
test. And one thing about bail reform, that is not a legal term. That is a term of art. So
mhm,
when I ran in 2016, hey, I championed bail reform because here's how it was defined then. We want to keep low-level,
sure.
nonviolent misdemeanants who can't afford bail out of jail. Okay, I'm for that.
Oh, me too. But I don't think
I
it's
want them,
happening.
I want them to go home and go back to work. That is not the bail reform that was incorporated into the O'Donnell settlement, the
Mhm.
Russell lawsuit, the Daves lawsuit, or operational practices. This is free crime for everyone. Is
Without
how bail
accountability.
reform should now be tagged. And And nobody would vote for it if it was free bail
Sure.
for everyone, regardless of how dangerous you are,
Mhm.
or what terrible crime you committed.
There was a former judge who was on a News Nation town hall, and she said, you know, until you have an alternative to the private industry bail system that has the same low failure to appear rate and the same high level of accountability, then you don't have an alternative. And if you look at the failure to appear rates of just giving personal bonds and you don't hold them accountable, and you would say an 80% failure to peer rate is no alternative. A 40% failure to peer rate is no alternative to the private industry that has less than a 10% failure to peer rate.
Right. What can I say? Our numbers are based on facts without
Mhm.
propaganda, and media fails to report them frequently. And what I would tell people is don't vote against your own interests.
What I would say is, some of the media in Harris County, as the use of private surety bail has gone down and crime has gone up, they're still reporting that it's the private surety bail it's their fault. Crime is increasing.
Okay, it is not the bail bondsman's fault. In fact, please let me turn you back to my early career as a line prosecutor.
Hmm.
When we had a defendant fail to show up in the 80s or 90s, I didn't call the marshal's service who goes out and finds dangerous fugitives. I didn't even call the sheriff's department warrant division, whose job it is to go find those folks and arrest them. I called the private bondsman because they knew where the defendant
Hmm.
was, they had skin in the game, and they almost always had an incentive to get that perpetrator back to court. It was a mutually beneficial relationship. And bondsmen have been part of our Texas criminal justice system since I started 37 years ago. What I would say is you've been villainized politically because it was convenient.
Hmm.
And when race was thrown into this mix, it was like gasoline to fire. This
Hmm.
was pre-George Floyd, but clearly we have minority communities that see our criminal justice system
Sure.
as oppressive. Well,
Or
this
scared.
is
It's
not the
scary.
way to fix it.
What does the future hold for the Harris County criminal justice system? Because, I would argue in the last two legislative sessions, statewide policies being kind of, uh, they're reacting to what's going on in Harris County.
Yeah.
And we have someone who's running in the primary, the general election, who says he thinks that George Soros gets a bad rap and that he's a good guy. And so, if he follows their dictates, they're going to double down on all these policies that have not worked. And it'll have to get worse before it get better, before we get to the point where these other counties are driving them away, if that's what happens. What do you think the future holds for Harris County?
I think that the next election will be critical to public safety, and that if the Democratic nominee who beat me, who promises to end cash bail, is elected, that we are going to see a crime wave like you haven't seen here in decades. People need structure, they need supervision, and some of them just need to be incarcerated
Mm.
so that we can protect others from them while they await trial. We need faster trials, which is going to necessitate more resources, which
Mhm.
is where my break with the Soros Group and the local commissioner's court originated. You cannot continue to starve the DA's office. You cannot continue to run the jail like like as chaotic as they have run it. It's all about funding. And meanwhile, we see our commissioners spending money like drunken sailors on out of state
Mhm.
consultants, on companies from out of state who we're not
Well,
sure what services they
to
perform.
implement a settlement that's now been said the case should have never been filed.
That's right. And so it was an excuse to spend millions of dollars out of state on non-public safety expenditures at the expense of crime victims here. And that's just wrong. And that's what I'm going out fighting against. I'll come back up after January 1 swinging, because it turns out I still have a law degree and a license to practice. And I think some of these cases truly need to be challenged.
Well, Kim Ogg, I want to thank you so much for coming to talk to me today. I've actually been very nervous about talking to you. I don't know why, but I've very much enjoyed talking to you, and I just thank you so much for spending your time with me.
Well, Ken, you've championed the right side of this cause. I found the bail bond industry to be truly reasonable in terms of misdemeanors. I really think we had a consensus about
Mhm.
poor people not being kept in jail for low-level offenses, and that they supported that. We all did, even though it was to the detriment financially of the industry.
Isn't that the lesson we're now learning from these charitable bail funds? They're getting in trouble because they're finding there's no low level poor people stuck in jail, so they're bonding out the career criminals and getting in trouble.
Amen, brother. That is what's happening. We succeeded in creating the lowest population in the state
Mhm.
of nonviolent misdemeanors in our jail, and got no credit for it. That is a
Yeah.
huge accomplishment. What we see, however, is this continued push, and it's bail reform without limits
No
that
matter the bad consequences.
released murderers who were too dangerous,
Mhm.
rapists, robbers who were too dangerous to be among the public. They killed innocent people. Let's stop that.
And what do they have for it? The jail is full. The jail is full right now. They have no room for accountability now because they haven't. So now we've used the misdemeanors to be the training ground for the new felons, and we're completely full on felons.
That's right. And
All
I
right.
think this plan to make Harris County Jail like Rikers Island so awful that we must close it, that's really a motive here. I
Mhm,
think
mhm,
that
mhm,
dismantling the criminal justice system is the true motive. I'm against that.
mhm.
There's no replacement.
Reducing capacity will force reforms. That's their mindset. That's what they did in California.
Well, and shrinking the
Mhm,
budget, starving
mhm.
law enforcement financially. And we're, as Houstonians, we're against that. So let's keep up the fight.
Well, I can't tell you that I could talk to you for another hour, but I mean, I tried to make this very limited, and I think this has been great. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Ken.
Thank you for listening, and come back for the next episode of the Bell Post.